Picture this. It's 1983, the heart of Charlotte Motor Speedway. Heat rising off the asphalt in waves you can practically see from the grandstands. And somewhere, deep inside the garage area, behind the wall of toolboxes and tire racks, Richard Petty's crew chief is about to pull off one of the most audacious cheating schemes in the entire history of NASCAR. Now, while every other team in the paddock is obsessing over aerodynamic profiles, engine displacement tolerances, and carburetor jetting, this mechanic decides to do something so breathtakingly simple, so brazenly obvious in hindsight, that when NASCAR officials finally catch on, they will fine the team $35,000 and strip them of 104 championship points. The weapon of choice was not some exotic fuel additive or a cleverly hidden nitrous system. It was 4 inches of rubber that should not have existed on those wheels. 4 inches that rewrote the physics of that Pontiac and gave the king an edge nobody could see, nobody could measure, and nobody even thought to look for. This is a story of how one mechanic's illegal tire modification changed NASCAR forever, exposed the sport's single biggest vulnerability, and proved once and for all that sometimes the simplest tricks are the most absolutely devastating. This is Legacy Motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the invisible engineering tricks that changed motorsport history. If you're someone who obsesses over the hidden technical details behind NASCAR's most infamous scandals and wants to understand how a few inches of rubber rewrote the rulebook, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, to really understand why oversized tires were such a game changer, we need to travel back in time and immerse ourselves in the world of NASCAR in the early 1980s. This was, without exaggeration, the golden age of creative rule interpretation. Teams were not just racing each other on Sunday afternoon in front of packed grandstands and millions of television viewers. They were engaged in a constant, relentless, never-ending technological arms race from Monday morning through Saturday night. The rulebook in those days was more of a polite suggestion than holy scripture, and the unofficial motto that echoed through every garage from Daytona to Darlington was simple: if you are not cheating, you are not trying hard enough. Here's the thing. Richard Petty, the king himself, was already a living legend by 1983. 7 Cup championships, 198 career victories, a reputation that somehow managed to blend the image of a gentleman racer with that of a fierce, uncompromising competitor. The man signed autographs for every single fan who asked, and he drove like he was trying to put you into the wall if you dared challenge him for position. But even kings need an edge. And in the world of NASCAR, that edge almost always came from the garage, not from the driver's seat. The difference between winning and finishing 10th was rarely about who had the most talent behind the wheel. It was about who had the smartest, most creative, most willing to push boundaries crew back in the shop. Petty's crew chief and the mechanics working on that iconic number 43 Pontiac understood something fundamental about oval track racing that seems painfully obvious now, but was genuinely revolutionary thinking at the time. On an oval, you are constantly turning left. Every lap, every corner, every single moment of competitive racing involves the car rotating to the left. The car's weight transfers to the right side through those corners, loading up the right side tires and suspension components with enormous force. But the left side tires are doing something equally critical that most people overlook entirely. They are maintaining the car's stability. They are controlling the rate of rotation. They are determining how quickly and how smoothly the car can change direction. More grip on the left side does not just mean marginally faster cornering speeds. It means the entire physics equation of the car fundamentally changes. The balance shifts, the handling transforms, the driver's confidence skyrockets, and that confidence, that trust in the machine beneath you, translates directly into speed. Here is where the genius of the scheme really reveals itself. NASCAR had strict, clearly defined rules about tire specifications. Every single team in the field had to use the same Goodyear Eagles mounted on 15-inch wheels, inflated to specific pressures mandated by the sanctioning body, and most importantly, sized exactly to NASCAR's published specifications. Before every race, officials would check tire compounds under controlled conditions. They would examine tread patterns for any any unauthorized modifications. They would verify date codes stamped into the sidewalls to ensure nobody was running specially manufactured rubber that had been cooked up in some secret Goodyear laboratory. The inspection process was thorough for its era, and most teams accepted that tires were one area where you simply could not gain an advantage. The sanctioning body had that box locked down tight, or so everyone believed. The mechanic's solution to the problem of gaining a tire advantage was breathtakingly, almost insultingly simple. He did not change the tire compound. He did not alter the tread pattern or experiment with exotic rubber formulations. He did not mess with special materials or chemical treatments that might change the way the rubber interacted with asphalt at different temperatures. He just made the left side tires bigger, 4 inches bigger in circumference to be exact. That is it. That was the entire scheme in its beautiful, elegant simplicity. Bigger tires on the left side of the car. Now, you might be thinking 4 inches does not sound like much, and on a tire that already measures approximately 87 inches in circumference, we're talking about less than a 5% increase. Barely noticeable to the naked eye, virtually invisible when mounted on the rim and inflated to proper pressure. But here's what most people do not realize about racing. In this world, victories are measured in hundreds of seconds. Positions are won and lost by inches. Championships are decided by margins so slim they would be considered statistical noise in any other context. In that world, a nearly 5% increase in left side tire circumference is not just significant, it is massive. It is the difference between qualifying 15th and qualifying on the second row. It is the gap between running in the middle of the pack and genuinely contending for race wins every single weekend. The technical execution of this scheme was nothing short of masterful. These were not simply standard tires that had been stretched on the rim or overinflated to artificially increase their diameter. That kind of amateur hour modification would have been immediately obvious to any inspector who had been around racing tires for more than a week. No. These were specially manufactured tires that looked identical to legal Goodyear Eagles in every single measurable way except their actual rolling circumference. When mounted on the rim, inflated to the proper NASCAR-mandated pressure and subjected to a standard visual inspection, they appeared completely, utterly normal. You would need to actually wrap a tape measure around the tire and measure the rolling circumference to catch the difference. And in 1983, absolutely nobody was doing that. It simply was not part of the inspection protocol. Nobody had ever thought to check because nobody had ever imagined someone would try something this brazen. Think about what those extra 4 inches actually meant when that Pontiac hit the track at speed. First, and most obviously, there is the contact patch. A larger tire, even one that is only slightly larger in circumference, puts more rubber on the asphalt surface. More rubber in contact with the track means more mechanical grip. More grip means higher cornering speeds, which on oval track, where you spend roughly 60% of every lap in a corner, is an enormous competitive advantage. But that increase in contact patch is really just the beginning of the story. This is where it gets really interesting. The larger circumference also changed the effective gear ratio on the left side of the car. Now, this is a concept that trips up even experienced racing enthusiasts, so let me break it down with an analogy. Imagine you have 2 wheels on a bicycle, but one is slightly larger than the other. For every single rotation both wheels make, the larger wheel covers more ground. It travels a greater distance. In essence, the larger left side tires on Petty's Pontiac were traveling slightly farther than the right side tires for each identical revolution. This created a natural, built-in tendency for the car to rotate to the left. The car wanted to turn left. It was biased toward turning left simply because of the difference in tire circumference from one side to the other. Now, you might be thinking, so what? The car turns left a little easier. But the implications are profound. This natural rotation tendency reduced the steering input needed from the driver and dramatically decreased the load on the front tires. Less steering input means less scrub, less drag from the front tires fighting against the direction of travel. Less front tire load means those front tires last longer, maintain their grip window longer, and provide more consistent feedback to the driver throughout a long fuel run. The car became more stable and more predictable through corners, which meant the driver could carry more speed with more confidence. And in racing, confidence is speed. That is not a metaphor, it is a literal, measurable fact. There was also a subtle but significant aerodynamic benefit that most people completely overlook when they discuss the scandal. The slightly taller left side tires raised that side of the car just enough to alter the airflow pattern underneath the chassis. In NASCAR, where ride height is strictly regulated down to fractions of an inch, gaining even the smallest amount of additional clearance without triggering an inspection failure is incredibly valuable. The raised left side improved the car's rake angle, which is the difference in ride height between the front and rear of the car. A properly optimized rake angle reduces aerodynamic drag on the straightaways while maintaining or even increasing downforce through the corners. Petty's car was effectively running a different aerodynamic configuration than every other car in the field, and nobody could see it because the difference was hidden in the tires, not in the bodywork. But the real magic, the advantage that compounded every other benefit, happened with heat management. Racing tires operate in a very specific temperature window where they provide maximum grip. Too cold and the rubber is hard and slippery, unable to conform to the microscopic texture of the track surface. Too hot and the rubber begins to break down, blistering and chunking as the chemical bonds in the compound start to fail. Every team in NASCAR struggled with this balance. Track temperatures change throughout a race as the sun moves across the sky. Fuel load decreases, changing the weight on the tires. Traffic patterns affect airflow and cooling. Managing tire temperatures across a full race distance was one of the most challenging aspects of competition. The oversized left side tires had more mass and more surface area than their legal counterparts. This additional material allowed them to absorb and dissipate heat more effectively, acting almost like a larger heat sink compared to standard tires. While other teams were watching their left side tires overheat and lose grip in the final 20 laps of a fuel run, Petty's illegal rubber maintained its optimal operating temperature for significantly longer. Testing conducted after the scandal was exposed showed that the larger tires could maintain their peak grip window for 15 to 20% longer than standard specification tires under identical conditions. Over the course of a 500-mile race with multiple long green flag runs, that advantage was absolutely devastating. The psychological dimension of this scheme was equally powerful, though it is rarely discussed in technical analyses. Richard Petty and his team knew they had an edge. They knew with absolute certainty that their car had capabilities that no other car in the field possessed. That knowledge, that confidence, translates directly to on-track performance in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Petty could push harder in qualifying, trusting that the tires would stick when he needed them to. He could be more aggressive in race traffic, confident that the extra grip would get him through tight three-wide situations that other drivers would shy away from. He could run deeper into corners, brake later, get on the throttle earlier, because he knew, deep in his bones, that those left-side tires had more to give than anyone else's. For several races during the 1983 season, the trick worked with flawless, almost eerie perfection. Petty's team was consistently competitive, running speeds that were just fast enough to be impressive but not so fast as to raise immediate suspicion. The car passed pre-race technical inspection without incident. It passed post-race inspection without a single flag. It survived random spot checks during race weekends. NASCAR officials examined it, poked at it, crawled under it, and found nothing. Other teams looked at the 43 car with suspicion, as teams always look at fast competitors, but nobody could identify anything specific. It was, by every measure, the perfect crime. Look, here is the thing that makes this story so much more complicated and so much more fascinating than a simple tale of cheating. The oversized tires were not the only illegal modification on Petty's car, not by a long shot. At the same time the team was running bigger left-side rubber, they were simultaneously executing another trick that would become equally infamous in NASCAR lore. They had developed a system of illegal fuel additives hidden inside hollow frame rails within the car's roll cage structure. The frame rail scheme was almost comically elaborate compared to the elegant simplicity of the tire modification. The team had carefully modified the car's roll cage and chassis frame rails to create hidden compartments within the structural tubing. These compartments were filled with specially formulated fuel additives, chemical compounds designed to increase the effective octane rating of the race fuel. During the race, as the car vibrated and flexed through corners and over bumps, these additives would slowly leak from their hidden compartments into the main fuel system through carefully engineered pathways that look like normal welds and joints to any inspector who was not specifically looking for them. The result was that Petty's engine was effectively running on fuel with a higher octane rating than anyone else in the field. Higher octane fuel allows for more aggressive ignition timing without the risk of detonation, which is the uncontrolled explosion of the fuel-air mixture that can destroy an engine in milliseconds. More aggressive timing meant more complete combustion, which meant more horsepower extracted from every drop of fuel. Conservative estimates suggested the fuel advantage alone was worth somewhere between 15 and 25 additional horsepower, a meaningful number in an era when total engine output was typically in the 500 to 550 horsepower range. Now, here is the beautiful irony that makes this entire story so compelling. It was actually the fuel system modification, not the tires, that led to the unraveling of the entire scheme. During a particularly thorough post-race technical inspection at Charlotte Motor Speedway, NASCAR officials discovered evidence of the illegal fuel delivery system. Something did not add up in the fuel sample analysis, or perhaps a sharp-eyed inspector noticed something unusual about the frame rail construction. The exact trigger for the deeper investigation varies depending on who tells a story, but the result was the same. Once NASCAR officials found one violation, they decided to tear the entire car apart and check absolutely everything. Every measurement, every specification, every component that could possibly be outside the rules. That is when they discovered the left side tires were 4 inches too large in circumference. The inspector who made the discovery later described measuring the tires 3 separate times because he could not believe what his tape measure was telling him. The circumference was so consistently oversized, so precisely manufactured to be exactly 4 inches larger than specification, that he initially thought his measuring equipment was faulty or that he was making an error in his methodology. Only after confirming with multiple measuring tools and having a second inspector independently verify the readings did he realize he had uncovered one of the most significant cheating scandals in NASCAR's storied history. NASCAR's reaction was swift, decisive, and brutal. The fine of $35,000 was an enormous sum for 1983. To put that in perspective, adjusted for inflation, that is equivalent to roughly $100,000 in today's money. Some smaller teams in the NASCAR garage operated on total annual budgets that were not dramatically larger than that single fine. But the financial penalty, as painful as it was, paled in comparison to the competitive damage of the points penalty. 104 championship points stripped from Petty's season total essentially destroyed any chance the team had of competing for the Cup championship that year. It was one of the harshest penalties NASCAR had ever levied against any competitor, and it sent an unmistakable message to every team in the garage. The era of blatant, brazen rule-breaking was over, or at least it was going to cost you dearly if you got caught. The racing world absolutely exploded with controversy. The reaction split along predictable but fascinating lines. One camp saw the penalty as justice, long overdue accountability finally catching up with a team that had been bending, stretching, and occasionally snapping rules for years. They pointed to the elaborate nature of the schemes, both the tires and the fuel system, as evidence that this was not a one-time lapse in judgment, but a systematic, deliberate program of cheating that undermined the competitive integrity of the entire sport. The other camp, equally vocal and equally passionate, argued that creative interpretation of the rules was woven into NASCAR's very DNA, that it was as much a part of the sport's identity as the checkered flag and the victory lap. They contended that Petty was being punished not for cheating, but for being too successful at a game that every single team in the garage was playing. The only difference, they argued, was that Petty's team was better at it than everyone else. Draw the line wherever you want, they said, but do not pretend that anyone in this garage is running a completely legal car. Petty himself maintained a dignified silence in the immediate aftermath, choosing not to publicly defend the modifications or attack NASCAR's decision. But years later, in interviews and casual conversations at industry events, he admitted with characteristic candor that his teams had always pushed the boundaries of what the rules allowed. He was diplomatic about it, as Petty usually was, framing it less as cheating and more as competitive innovation, taken perhaps a step too far. But the message was clear. Everyone was doing it. His team simply got caught. The mechanic who masterminded the oversized tire trick became something of a folk hero in NASCAR garages across the country. Here was a man who had outsmarted the entire sanctioning body, every inspector, every competitor, every engineer in the paddock, with something so elegantly simple it bordered on genius. No complex engineering solutions requiring advanced degrees in material science, no exotic technology smuggled in from aerospace programs or military research, just 4 inches of extra rubber applied with surgical precision to exploit a blind spot that nobody even knew existed. The immediate impact on NASCAR's technical regulations was profound and far-reaching. Within weeks of the scandal becoming public, the sanctioning body implemented a comprehensive slate of new inspection procedures, specifically targeting tire measurements. They started measuring rolling circumference, not just static tire dimensions like width and sidewall height. They began marking individual tires with unique identifiers before races and checking those exact same marked tires afterward to ensure no substitutions had been made. They developed specialized templates and precision gauges designed specifically to catch oversized tires, instruments that could detect variations of less than a quarter inch in circumference. The days of eyeballing tire sizes were over, permanently. But the bigger transformation was philosophical rather than procedural. NASCAR's leadership realized, perhaps for the first time with painful clarity, that teams would exploit any ambiguity, any gap, any blind spot in the inspection process, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The rulebook underwent a fundamental restructuring. What had previously been gentlemen's agreements and general guidelines became ironclad, hyper-specific regulations with clearly defined penalties attached to each individual violation. The document grew thicker, denser, more detailed with every passing season. Other teams, meanwhile, drew completely different lessons from the scandal. Their reasoning was simple and devastating in its logic. If Petty's crew could run oversized tires for multiple consecutive races without detection, passing every inspection thrown at them, what else was possible? What other blind spots existed in NASCAR's inspection process? What other simple, elegant modifications could provide a competitive advantage while evading detection? The incident did not discourage cheating. It inspired an entirely new generation of creative cheating. Teams began investing more resources than ever into finding loopholes, hiring engineers specifically tasked with interpreting rules creatively, and developing modifications that could pass inspection while providing advantages that the rule writers never imagined. The technical evolution that followed was genuinely fascinating to track. Teams immediately started experimenting with tire pressures that would change dynamically during races as the tires heated up from friction with the track surface. They developed special valve stems engineered to release pressure at carefully calibrated rates, allowing the tire to start a run at one pressure and gradually transition to a lower, more advantageous pressure as the rubber reached its optimal operating temperature. They even experimented with tire compounds that would change their grip characteristics as the rubber wore down, becoming stickier in the middle of a run when the car was lightest on fuel and the track was hottest. None of these innovations were as simple or as devastatingly effective as just making the tires 4 inches bigger, but they demonstrated how one elegant trick had blown open the floodgates of creative tire engineering. The oversized tire incident also fundamentally changed how teams approached vehicle dynamics as a discipline. If 4 inches of tire circumference could make that dramatic a difference in lap times and race performance, what about weight distribution? What about suspension geometry and the dozens of adjustable parameters hidden within it? What about the hundreds of small aerodynamic details that inspectors might overlook because they were focused on the big, obvious things? Suddenly, every single aspect of the race car was fair game for creative interpretation. Nothing was too small to optimize, too insignificant to examine, too mundane to modify. Engine builders across the garage took notice as well, and their conclusions were troubling for NASCAR's enforcement apparatus. If Petty's team was willing to hide fuel additives inside hollow frame rails and run custom-manufactured oversized tires, what modifications might be lurking inside the engines themselves that nobody had caught? Competitors began demanding more thorough, more invasive engine inspections. This grassroots pressure from the teams themselves eventually led to the development of NASCAR's current system, where engines are randomly confiscated after races for complete teardown inspections conducted by independent engineers at NASCAR's Research and Development Center. The safety implications of the oversized tire scandal were sobering and demanded serious consideration. Oversized tires change a car's handling characteristics in ways that might not be entirely predictable, especially in failure modes. If one of those oversized left side tires failed catastrophically at speed, blowing out on the backstretch at 180 miles per hour, the car would behave differently than engineers and safety designers expected. The handling response to a blowout is partially determined by the tire's dimensions, and the tire that is 4 inches out of specification throws all those calculations into uncertainty. NASCAR had to consider not just competitive fairness and sportsmanship, but the fundamental safety of every driver on the track. This concern led to the development of more stringent tire testing and certification protocols, and the requirement that teams use only NASCAR-approved tires with specific serial numbers that could be tracked from the Goodyear manufacturing facility all the way to the disposal bin after the race. From a pure engineering perspective, divorced from any questions of ethics or sportsmanship, the oversized tire trick was elegant in its simplicity in a way that would make any engineer smile with grudging admiration. No modern electronics, no exotic composite materials, no complex computational analysis, just the basic, intuitive understanding of physics, specifically the relationship between contact patch area and grip force, combined with the audacity and the nerve to act on that understanding when everyone else assumed tires were an area where you could not gain an advantage. The mechanic had identified a fundamental truth about oval track racing and exploited it with minimal risk of mechanical failure. The oversized tires were not stressed beyond their design parameters. They were not weakened or compromised in any way. They were simply larger, and that simple difference changed everything. The grip improvement from those 4 extra inches was both measurable and significant when subjected to rigorous post-scandal analysis. Testing conducted by NASCAR and independent engineers after the scheme was exposed showed that the oversized left side tires could improve cornering speeds by 2 to 3 miles per hour under optimal conditions. Now, 2 to 3 miles per hour might not sound dramatic in everyday driving terms, but in racing, where the difference between first place and 10th place can be measured in tenths of a second per lap, that speed increase is transformative. Over the course of a 500-mile race consisting of hundreds of laps, that cornering speed advantage compounds into a total time difference measured in full seconds. That is the difference between winning convincingly and finishing deep in the field. The heat management benefits were equally impressive when quantified. As I mentioned earlier, the larger tires could maintain their optimal operating temperature for 15 to 20% longer than standard specification tires under identical test conditions. In the early 1980s, before the development of specialized tire compounds tailored to individual tracks, this advantage was particularly devastating on a brace of track surfaces that chewed through standard tires aggressively. Tracks like Darlington, Bristol, and North Wilkesboro were notorious for destroying left-side tires. The extra rubber mass and surface area of the oversized tires provided a thermal buffer that kept them in their grip window when everyone else's tires were starting to slide. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the entire scheme, the element that truly elevates it from simple cheating to something approaching criminal genius, was the detection avoidance strategy. The mechanic had identified a specific blind spot in NASCAR's inspection process and exploited it with surgical precision. The tires looked right to visual inspection. They felt right when you squeezed the sidewall. They even measured right under the standard dimensional checks that NASCAR performed, because inspectors were measuring width, sidewall height, and tread depth, not rolling circumference. Nobody wrapped a tape measure around the outside of the tire because nobody thought anyone would modify that particular dimension. It was a masterclass in understanding not just the technical rules themselves, but how those rules were actually enforced in practice, and finding the gap between the two. The scandal also pulled back the curtain on the complex, sometimes uncomfortable relationship between tire manufacturers, racing teams, and the sanctioning body. Goodyear, as NASCAR's sole tire supplier, found itself in an extraordinarily awkward position. The company officially claimed absolutely no knowledge of the specially manufactured oversized tires, but somebody had to make them. You cannot produce a racing tire with precisely controlled dimensions using home workshop equipment. The manufacturing process requires industrial molds, specialized curing ovens, quality control instrumentation, and deep expertise in rubber chemistry. Either someone within Goodyear's racing division was complicit in producing the oversized tires, or the team had access to tire manufacturing capabilities that rivaled those of a major industrial supplier. Neither explanation was particularly comfortable for anyone involved. The scandal led directly to new protocols governing tire production, distribution, inventory control, and chain of custody tracking that persists in modified form to this day. The financial ramifications extended well beyond the $35,000 fine. Sponsors were deeply unhappy about being associated with a cheating scandal, even though privately many corporate representatives understood that pushing boundaries was part of NASCAR's competitive culture. In 1983, NASCAR was in the midst of a significant transition from regional entertainment to national big business. Television contracts were growing, corporate sponsorship dollars were increasing. The sport was attracting attention from Fortune 500 companies who demanded a certain level of professional integrity from their marketing partners. Petty's team had to navigate extremely delicate conversations with corporate sponsors about the difference between competitive innovation and outright cheating. It was an uncomfortable reminder that the outlaw spirit that had built NASCAR could also threaten its commercial future. The media coverage was intense and sustained. This was 1983, years before the internet, before 24-hour sports news networks, before social media could amplify every rumor and opinion to millions of people instantaneously. But even within the limitations of print media and weekly racing publications, the oversized tire story dominated coverage for months. Every racing magazine in the country ran detailed analyses. Newspaper sports sections picked up the story. Even mainstream media outlets covered it as a quirky, colorful tale from the world of stock car racing. Everyone wanted to know the same things. How exactly was it done? Who knew about it? How long had it been going on? And most tantalizingly, what other secrets might be hidden in NASCAR garages across the country? Fellow drivers had mixed and often contradictory reactions. Some were genuinely outraged that Petty, the king, the man who was supposed to represent everything good about the sport, had been racing with illegal modifications while they were competing with legal equipment. These drivers felt personally cheated, robbed of positions and prize money they might have earned if the playing field had been level. Others, often the more experienced veterans who had been around the garage long enough to understand its culture, admired the creativity and wished their own teams had thought of it first. The incident reinforced an existing divide in the driver community between those who saw themselves as pure racers competing on talent alone and those who understood that NASCAR had always been as much about engineering, innovation, and creative problem solving as it was about driving skill. The legacy of the oversized tire scandal extends far beyond the borders of NASCAR. Other racing series around the world took careful notice of the incident and preemptively tightened their own inspection procedures to prevent similar exploits. The FIA, the governing body that oversees Formula One and dozens of other international racing categories, specifically referenced the Petty tire scandal in internal communications when updating their own tire regulations. Even drag racing sanctioning bodies and sports car racing organizations reviewed and revised their rules to ensure that tire dimensions were being verified with sufficient rigor. One mechanic's trick in a stock car garage in North Carolina had rippled outward to affect the regulatory framework of motorsports globally. In the decades since 1983, the story has evolved from current events into full-blown NASCAR folklore. It is told and retold in garages across the country as both a cautionary tale and an inspirational legend, sometimes simultaneously. Young mechanics entering the sport hear about it and dream of finding their own 4-inch advantage, their own elegant exploit that nobody else has thought of. Veteran crew chiefs reference it when explaining to newcomers why certain seemingly arbitrary rules exist and why inspectors measure things that appear insignificant. The technical documentation generated during the investigation has become genuine study material in motorsports engineering programs at universities that offer such curricula. How did the team manufacture the tires while maintaining quality and consistency? How did they coordinate the logistics of storing, transporting, and mounting illegal tires without any team member leaking information to competitors or officials? These questions are examined as case studies in project management and organizational security as much as in engineering and physics. Here is what most people do not realize about the modern state of NASCAR tire control. Today's sanctioning body has implemented a system that would make those 1983 oversized tires impossible to run for even a single lap. Contemporary NASCAR tires have radio frequency identification chips embedded directly into the rubber during manufacturing. Each tire is assigned a unique electronic identity that is registered in a central database and tracked from the moment it leaves the Goodyear production facility to the moment it is mounted on a car, used in competition, and ultimately disposed of. Laser measurement systems deployed during inspections can detect dimensional variations of less than 1 millimeter, a fraction of the size of those 4 infamous inches. Rolling circumference is checked multiple times during a race weekend, not just before or after the main event. The chain of custody for every single tire is documented and auditable. The system is, for all practical purposes, impossible to defeat with the kind of simple dimensional modification that worked so brilliantly 4 decades ago. But the spirit of innovation that drove the creation of those oversized tires lives on in every NASCAR garage, in every engineering office, in every late-night brainstorming session where crew chiefs and engineers search for the next competitive edge. The methods have changed dramatically, but the underlying motivation is identical. Teams now focus their creative energy on areas that are inherently more difficult to police and inspect. They invest millions of dollars in computational fluid dynamics to discover aerodynamic advantages that only manifest at specific speeds and yaw angles. They develop proprietary simulation software that can model hundreds of setup variables simultaneously, finding optimizations that would take decades to discover through physical testing alone. They push boundaries in material science, in manufacturing tolerances, in data analysis methodologies. The game continues relentlessly, just with different rules, different tools, and different vulnerabilities to exploit. The human element of this story is frequently overlooked in favor of the technical details, and that is a shame because it is arguably the most compelling dimension of the entire saga. The mechanic who developed the oversized tire concept was not some cartoonish villain attempting to destroy NASCAR's competitive integrity for personal gain. He was a racer, a competitor, a craftsman who spent his life turning wrenches, studying tire wear patterns, observing how cars behaved in corners, and absorbing the subtle feedback that experienced drivers communicated about their machines. He was trying to win using every tool, every insight, every advantage at his disposal, which is exactly what every competitor in the history of organized sport has tried to do since the first race was run. In interviews conducted years and decades after the scandal, team members described the atmosphere inside the shop during those weeks of running the illegal tires as electric. There was a shared sense of purpose, a collective energy that came from knowing they had discovered something that nobody else had. Everyone worked harder, everyone pushed further, everyone believed more deeply in what they were doing. The secret bonded them together and drove their performance to levels that surprised even themselves. But the pressure must have been absolutely immense. Every pre-race inspection was a potential catastrophe. Every interaction with a NASCAR official carried the risk of discovery. Every time an inspector knelt beside the car and examined the tire, hearts must have stopped beating for a moment. Every victory was celebrated publicly, but privately shadowed by the knowledge that it could be taken away, that the championship points earned today could be stripped tomorrow. Living with that secret across multiple race weekends took a psychological toll on everyone involved that is difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. Richard Petty himself emerged from the scandal with his reputation remarkably, almost inexplicably intact. The king had accumulated such an enormous reservoir of goodwill through his genuine kindness to fans, his ambassadorship for the sport, and his undeniable talent behind the wheel that the public was willing to separate the team's actions from his personal legacy. The scandal added complexity and nuance to his story, but it did not diminish his stature. He was not merely a great driver. He was a complete competitor who understood that success in NASCAR required excellence in every dimension, from driving skill to mechanical preparation to strategic risk-taking, even when that risk-taking crossed lines that the sanctioning body had drawn. The competitive advantage those 4 inches provided deserves one final comprehensive accounting because the numbers are genuinely staggering when you add them all up. In qualifying, the extra grip from the increased contact patch and the improved handling balance could translate to 2 or 3 grid positions. Starting 5th instead of 8th means cleaner air, fewer cars to pass, less risk of being caught up in someone else's mistake. In race conditions, the heat management advantage meant the ability to run harder for longer without suffering tire degradation, gaining time on competitors during the critical final laps of fuel runs when everyone else's tires were falling off. In traffic, the improved handling balance provided the confidence and the mechanical capability to make aggressive passing moves, to run 3 wide through corners that other drivers would approach with more caution, to exploit gaps that existed for only fractions of a second. Every single aspect of competitive performance improved with those 4 inches of additional tire circumference: speed, consistency, confidence, heat management, handling balance, aerodynamic efficiency. When you add all of those marginal gains together, you do not get a marginal advantage, you get a transformative one. The penalty announcement sent shockwaves through every level of stock car racing. $35,000 exceeded what some smaller independent teams spent in an entire season. 104 championship points was enough to transform a legitimate title contender into a mid-pack afterthought in the final standings. NASCAR was making an unmistakable statement to every team owner, every crew chief, every mechanic in every garage across the country. There would be consequences. Real consequences. The price of getting caught would hurt badly enough to make even the most aggressive innovators think twice. But the innovation never stopped. It never could. Within months of the tire scandal, teams were already developing the next generation of creative rule exploitation. Adjustable aerodynamic devices that would subtly change shape at racing speeds, providing additional downforce in corners while reducing drag on straightaways. Brake cooling systems ingeniously designed to serve double duty as aerodynamic elements, generating downforce from components that inspectors categorized as cooling hardware rather than bodywork. Suspension systems with hidden adjustability that could be modified during pit stops in ways that were technically legal but clearly outside the spirit of the regulations. The arms race did not pause for even a moment. The oversized tire scandal also fundamentally influenced how NASCAR drafted future regulations. Instead of writing rules that said tires must be approximately a certain size, officials began specifying exact Goodyear part numbers, manufacturing date ranges, and individual serial numbers. They moved from principles-based regulation to specifications-based regulation, from describing what they wanted to prescribing exactly what was permitted. The rulebook became less a philosophical document about fair competition and more a technical manual listing thousands of specific components and allowable tolerances. This transformation was a direct, traceable consequence of the creativity teams demonstrated when given even the smallest amount of interpretive freedom. Today, NASCAR teams employ dozens of engineers with advanced degrees in aerospace, mechanical, and material science. They spend millions annually on wind tunnel testing, computational simulation, and 7-post shake rigs that can simulate an entire race worth of road surface inputs in a laboratory environment. The tools have changed beyond recognition since 1983, but every single one of those engineers, every crew chief, every mechanic, is still chasing exactly the same thing that anonymous tire innovator was pursuing 4 decades ago: an advantage, an edge. Those crucial 4 inches, in whatever form they might take today, that separate winning from merely competing. The oversized tire story reminds us that racing has always been about far more than just driving. It is about innovation, creativity, lateral thinking, and the relentless, obsessive, never-satisfied pursuit of speed in all its forms. It is about finding advantages where others see only limitations. It is about pushing boundaries, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly, and occasionally right past their breaking point. Modern tire technology has evolved so far beyond what existed in 1983 that the two eras might as well be different sports. Today's racing tires are precision manufactured to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, with specific compounds engineered for individual tracks, weather conditions, even time of day. But the fundamental physics that made those oversized tires so effective have not changed one bit. The grip equation is eternal. More contact patch equals more grip. Better heat management equals more consistent performance over longer runs. Optimal tire dimensions equal faster, more predictable lap times. The mechanic who figured out how to add 4 inches to tire circumference understood these principles at an intuitive level that transcended formal education. That knowledge, that deep, practical understanding of how things really work, as opposed to how textbooks say they should work, cannot be taught in any engineering program. It comes from years of turning wrenches, from watching tires wear across thousands of laps, from feeling the difference between a car that is hooked up and one that is pushing, from absorbing and interpreting the subtle, sometimes contradictory feedback that experienced drivers provide about their machines. It is the difference between theoretical knowledge and hard-won practical wisdom, and it is what has always separated the truly great mechanics and engineers from merely competent ones. Looking back more than 40 years later, the audacity of the scheme still impresses, still surprises, still makes you shake your head and smile. In an era of increasing scrutiny and ever more detailed regulations, one mechanic looked at the problem of going faster and decided that the solution was the simplest thing imaginable. Just make the tires bigger. And for a brief, spectacular, glorious stretch of races, it worked absolutely perfectly. That is the enduring beauty of racing innovation. Sometimes the simplest ideas carry the most devastating power. The legacy lives on in every garage, every engineering meeting, every rules discussion, every late-night argument about where innovation ends and cheating begins. When teams push boundaries today, whether they know it or not, they are following in the footsteps of that mechanic who dared to add 4 inches. When officials write new regulations, they are trying to prevent the next version of that scheme. The dance between innovation and regulation continues, forever shaped by those oversized tires on a '43 Pontiac in 1983. What engineering innovation or racing scandal fascinates you the most? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether creative rule interpretation is cheating or simply part of the game. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories of automotive innovation, engineering brilliance, and the relentless pursuit of speed that defines everything we love about motorsports.